Right, morning everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can someone just wave if they can hear me okay? Make sure it's all working. Great. Normally I allow a couple of minutes for people to join, but we've got a lot to get through this morning, so I'm going to kick off and people can join as and when. So my name is Matt Saker, President of the IFoA, and it's my pleasure to be chairing the webinar today. So welcome to what is the first of 5 events running from now through to May in this new presidential speaker series, Alternate Economic Thinking, which is focusing on whether traditional economic models are still fit for purpose and able to tackle the many deep and difficult issues faced by societies all over the world, from climate change to rising inequality. So the idea of this series is that it will bring together experts from a range of economic disciplines, as well as the IFoA's own deep thought leadership community to discuss and debate whether alternate economic thinking is required to address the various challenges facing society, and perhaps most importantly, what these series could mean for the actuarial profession and its work. I should say, if you'd like to learn more about this issue after attending these webinars, the IFoA has an active economics member interest group, and there's plenty of information on the IFoA website. So in terms of today's session, we're really looking today to really introduce the concept of alternate economic thinking. The other 4 events that follow will tackle more specific issues, including the impact of this thinking on things like climate change and purposeful business. And I would encourage you all to sign up to those events via the IFoA's events page. I should also say that you'll be able to rewatch the full video today on the IFoA's virtual learning environment and also on our YouTube channel. So in addition to introducing the concept today, we're also going to seek to unpack the rationale behind the need for new economic thinking and some of the various alternate economic models being proposed, as well as exploring how new economic thought relates to actual work and how it might help address some of the big challenges in areas where actuaries apply their skills. And to do all that, I'm delighted to say that we've assembled an expert panel who I'm pleased now to introduce. So to start with, we have our very own Lucy Say. So Lucy is a dual qualified actuary and veterinary surgeon and a manager in the actuarial insurance and banking team at Deloitte. So her actuarial work has focused on both traditional life insurance actuarial roles across the production, reporting, capital and audit, as well as sustainability-focused roles across climate change and biodiversity. So Lucy, as many of you know, currently chairs the IFoA Sustainability Board, where since 2019 she's led the work on Sustainable Development Goals, and she also has a growing interest in the WHO's One Health initiative. Okay, next up we have William Hines. So William is a senior advisor to the Secretary General and the head of the New Approaches to Economic Challenges, NAEC, unit, which provides a space to question traditional economic ideas and offer new economic narratives, new tools, methods and policy approaches. He previously worked as a senior economist at NAEC, advisor in the Sherpa and Global Governance Unit, a policy analyst in the Development Cooperation Directorate, and an economic affairs officer at the World Trade Organization. So William is an associate fellow and adjunct professor in international economics at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and has a doctorate from Oxford University and was a Marie Curie fellow at the London School of Economics. And then last but not least, we have Angus Armstrong. So Angus is Director of Rebuilding Macroeconomics, an interdisciplinary research initiative funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, hosted at the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London. He's also Chief Economic Advisor to Lloyds Banking Group and a Senior Fellow at the ESRC's UK in a Changing Europe Centre. Prior to these posts, Angus was Director of Macroeconomics at the NIESR, where he was a Fellow in the Scottish Referendum responsible for examining currency and debt options. He was also head of macroeconomic analysis at HM Treasury, where he represented the UK as an official at the 2009 G20 meeting during the global financial crisis. And finally, he has a PhD from Imperial College and is Professor Research Fellow at UCL. So 3 very qualified panelists. that's the formalities over. I want to get stuck in now. The format of today's session will be in 3 parts. First part, I'm just going to allow each of the panelists to have 5 minutes to make some opening comments and remarks. Part 2 will then be to get into the Q&A. So to get that moving, we have a few questions that have been submitted in advance, which I'll put to the panelists. And then the third part will be an open Q&A where you guys can post your questions. And I'd encourage you to start posting questions straight away. So if anything pops up, put it in the Q&A and we'll pick it up in that third part. So 3 parts, roughly 20 minutes on each, I'm thinking. So that's how we're going to structure things. So without further ado, I will get stuck in, and I'll ask Lucy if you can kick off.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So the topic of today's session is an introduction to alternative economic thinking. So I thought it would be useful if I started by outlining what we mean by orthodox or mainstream economics and what we mean by heterodox or alternative economics, and then think about some of the developments that have been going on in economics itself and why they've been happening, and then thinking about why that impacts actuaries. So just as a sort of starting the discussion for today, when we think about mainstream or orthodox economics, we are talking about neoclassical economics. And when we're talking about heterodox economics or alternative economics, we are talking about everything else. And I'll expand on that a little bit now. So with neoclassical economics, this is based on the idea of rational economic man. We have individuals who are selfish, are pleasure-seeking, dedicated to maximizing their utility. They're these human supercomputers with perfect knowledge and perfect foresight, and they use this information to calculate all possible outcomes before making their decisions in a world that is certain. And these individuals interact with one another, and they interact in the market, and that delivers socially optimal outcomes where price represents value and the market converges to an equilibrium or it clears. They recognize that some things aren't priced in the market, and these are dealt with as externalities. So hopefully the description that I've given you is probably familiar to many on the call, because we have almost certainly all been taught it. If you're lucky, and depending on when and where you studied, you may have been taught some economic history, you might have been taught some economic pluralism, but this sort of outline of neoclassical economics is the economics 101 that we'll all be familiar with. Moving on to heterodox or alternative economics, the everything else bucket, that's actually a really diverse pool. So it's Keynesian, post-Keynesian, Austrian, Marxist, institutional, feminist, complexity, ecological, you can go on. And many of these are likely to be unfamiliar, and that's part of the problem, because neoclassical economics is often taught as a single truth, as if nothing else exists and isn't worth learning. Now, we're not clearly in an hour going to get through all of these different schools of thought and how they've evolved and where the ideas came from. We're not going to get through that today, but what we will do is discuss some aspects that are likely to be most relevant and useful to actuaries, and hopefully peel back some of the mysteriousness around economics. But what we've really seen within the economics profession itself is the growth of these alternative views. So the recognition that actually economic history is really important and that pluralism has a place. And this shift has sort of come post 2008 and post the global financial crisis and the following economic response, where everyone was really trying to understand what was going on. And I think it's fair to say we've got an increasing recognition that we're not operating in an equilibrium system. We operate with huge amounts of uncertainty. We can't understand the emergence of macroeconomic patterns by just studying individuals, and behaviour that is considered rational at the level of the individual isn't actually rational when everyone's doing it. And we've had the last couple of weeks have been fairly interesting from a financial perspective, where we can see exactly examples of that happening. We've also had the growth or rise of the awareness of environmental issues, so things like climate change and biodiversity loss. We've had the Dasgupta report report highlighting the failure of economics to properly address environmental issues. And we're also seeing the consequences of decades of underinvestment creating sort of social and political problems like inequality, cost of living, and poor health outcomes. And I think there's a recognition that economics itself needs to reflect some of these changes. Now, all of these, I would argue, have implications for actuaries as part of the general environment in which we operate, but also because we interact with the financial system, which itself is heavily influenced by economics. So I personally came at this from two angles, and one was trying to tackle that sustainability problem and think about what sort of economy do we need to deliver a net zero restore and protect nature by 2030 type of economy. And the second was really trying to unpick what on earth had happened in the global financial crisis and finding that the economics that I'd been taught in my actuarial exams just didn't really give me the right tools to understand that. Thankfully, I wasn't alone. Another group of actuaries had already been thinking about this, and in 2019, the IFoA commissioned a report by Dr. Ian Claytor on economic thought and actuarial practice, and that highlighted a few things. The report's available online for people to read it in full, but I thought I'd draw out just a couple of things here. So one was it highlighted that actuarial work relies on economics. That won't be a surprise to anybody here, but it noted that actuaries tend to passively use economics rather than proactively challenge it. And of course, that can be potentially problematic if there are issues with the underlying economic theory or if actuaries aren't aware of some of these limitations. But it also highlighted that that actuaries are really using a narrow area of economics, and we've sort of pigeonholed ourselves into one view of the world, and that economics we are using may not be the most helpful for the challenges we face in our day-to-day work. So the outcomes of this was the establishment of the economics member interest group, and that's now grown to a community which sort of actively engages in these issues and deals with these complex questions, and some of these we're going to explore today. So with that sort of context set, I will pass on to William to do his introduction.
Okay, well, thank you, Lucy, for that. And you covered a lot of ground. So let me maybe just build on what you said and comment on some of the things. The first thing is to push back a little bit about this idea of alternative economics. I think part of what the new economics movement is about is really trying to break the monopoly that economics has on understanding the economy. And the reason why we need economics has lots of problems, and you've mentioned many of them. But the economy is a complex adaptive system. To understand an economy, it can't be any one discipline that can do that, because we have to embrace what other fields have learned about behavior, about networks, about institutions, culture, evolution, and non-equilibrium systems. And in many cases, what we're trying to do is reduce, not take a reductionist approach, and to start off with a very rudimentary understanding of individuals and how that scales up to an economy, but to look at all of these different themes and issues and to have imagination when it comes to economics. And imagination, or failure of imagination, is what we generally turn to when things go wrong. After the 9/11 attacks, for example, the 9/11 Commission said there were 4 types of failures. Failures of imagination, policy, capabilities, and management. And imagination, it identified as really the crucial one, that it's not a gift usually associated with bureaucracies. And they recommended that it was crucial to find a way of routinizing, even bureaucratizing the exercise of imagination. When it comes to economics, of course, the Queen's question has also been very influential in framing much of this debate. When the Queen asked, why did the British Academy not see it coming, the global financial crisis? And in a letter in response, Tim Besley said that the failure to foresee the timing, extent, and severity of the crisis and to head it off, while it had many causes, was principally a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people, both in this country and internationally, to understand the risks to the system as a whole. And the critiques of economics have come from all over the place. But what's interesting is that some of the leading economists of the day have been extremely critical about economics. So, for example, there's Paul Romer, who's a Nobel Prize winner, former chief economist of the World Bank. He, in a paper about the trouble with macro, talked about the deference to authority, and that essentially it's the authorities who shape the discipline, and very few new incumbents in this, or new actors, have an incentive to challenge that authority. So old ideas get turned over. Jim Heckman has also talked about the crisis of conformity in economics. And when you ask economists themselves what they think of the discipline, for instance, a survey of 10,000 economists by Armin Falk and Peter Andre, what it found is that the results suggest that economics as a field does not appreciate and work on what economists collectively prefer. In other words, it suggested that economists actually want their field to be more interdisciplinary, more policy relevant, and more disruptive. And so there is really a need for an alternative way of thinking about economics. And just one other critic who's been very prominent in the inflation debate is Jeremy Rudd. And he's highlighted several analytical problems in macro and inflation expectations, and said at the time of the upsurge in inflation that really we didn't have a good theory. We didn't have a good understanding of inflation. But in his paper on that, he had a footnote which says, I leave aside the deeper concern that the primary role of mainstream economics in our society is to provide an apologetic for a criminally oppressive, unsustainable, and unjust social order. And that's from a leading economist at the Fed. So there is this is a really important debate. There's a lot of dimensions to it, and I look forward to getting into some of those during this discussion.
Thanks, William. That's great. Angus, you want to come in next?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. And if I may, first of all, congratulate the IFoA for having this series, which has got some very important issues that go well beyond your profession or our profession in terms of the significance of them. I'm going to try and pick up a couple of points that Lucy and William raised as I go through 5 remarks that I've got in the 5 minutes I've been allocated. So the first remark I would like to make, I think, is particularly apposite for actuaries, which is the role of uncertainty. Economics can be defined as the science of decision-making in well-defined circumstances. So we set out our objective function and our constraint, and we optimize. But one of the critical issues, of course, is we don't live in well-defined circumstances. We actually don't know what the future is going to be. In fact, we have a very, very hard time telling what the present really is the real truth. And many people say, yes, okay, well, that just leads to a bigger error between our model prediction and reality. Yep, that's one cost. But the more significant impact or consequence of leaving aside uncertainty is we don't ask the question, so how do people behave in uncertainty? Because we all acknowledge that we live in a world of uncertainty, and we are actually, as a species, we are the great experts for dealing with this stuff. So how do we really do it? And Haynes gave us a hint in his 1937 QJE article, The General Theory of Employment, and he said about uncertainty, quote, we just do not know. And people often leave the quote there. But in the very next sentence, he says, but practical men have to get on with business. And he gave 3 possible ways to do this, one of which is looking at our neighbors and copying them. So we have to ask these questions of how do we actually behave in uncertainty? That's the first point. The second point is economists are obsessed, I think obsessed is a fair word, with equilibrium. Lucy hinted at this, and it's quite stark. We start off by assuming an equilibrium and then say what behaviors are consistent with that outcome. Otherwise, it doesn't count as a legitimate theory. That's an extraordinary constraint to put on right at the very beginning before we even start thinking. Now, is there an alternative? There is an alternative. The alternative is emergence. Emergence describes a property where you combine 2 items, and you get an outcome which is different to what you would predict from looking at each of those two items on their own. John Stuart Mill, so it's an old idea. John Stuart Mill had the classic example of hydrogen and oxygen. So if you have a fire, you don't really want to put more oxygen on or more hydrogen on, you just make it worse. The combined hydrogen and oxygen, you create water, put that on a fire, and you get a totally different effect. At different temperatures, one of them freezes, the other ones don't. So we have very different properties, which is called emergence. Now that's just chemicals. Think a bit about it between humans. We've all had examples where we look at a couple who've got married and we say, gosh, their behaviors begin to reflect each other. We do that. We are the greatest reciprocators and copiers of other people. We react differently when we interact with other people. The key point about emergence is it might be an equilibrium, it might be a basin, it might be disequilibrium, it could be lots of different things. But that is a perfectly legitimate solution mechanism using lots of other sciences, but not economics. Third point, fixed preferences. They're called primitive assumptions. Primitive because we kind of think that they are absolutely fundamental to who we are as human beings. We take them as given. Now, this may or may not be a reasonable starting point. There's a long debate about this in the 1970s, but I really think this is worth something. This is worth us taking a moment to really reflect on. You know, if I Google football boots and then go to my TV and turn on Sky TV, I'll pretty soon get adverts for football boots because they sell what I'm searching for. Now, I think you'd be a brave man to argue that my preferences and tastes can't be influenced by any advertising at all. I certainly know they can. So the longer that we go on with this presumption that preferences are outside of the domain of economics, we could be walking into some very serious political problems until we start opening up and saying, maybe we can be influenced by outside technology. And this could have significant repercussions, not only for our economic systems, but also our political systems. So I think we have to raise that core assumption. Fourth point, how do we interact? Now, once economists sort of acknowledge that you interact, you might say, but we've got game theory. That's a theory of interaction. Okay, but in game theory, we assume you know the rules of the interaction. Well, where did that come from? So we keep getting back to this problem of how do we form these norms and rules in society? Now, one thing is we could just let us bump into each other and figure them out, which we do very well in our groups through things like forming norms and behaviors and values. But in the past, we also used to do things like we shaped how we interact by creating things called institutions. Institutions are legal systems, profoundly important to capitalism, because without a legal system, it's hard to know where you go. Central banks, they're just institutions we created to make us as a nation have certain ways of interacting in ways that don't lead to, say, repeated financial crises. And also allow us to pay for things like defense of the realm. This was one of the core points that Adam Smith raised, the three responsibilities of government. One is to defend its citizens. The second is to administer a reasonable level of justice. And the third is to provide institutions which the private sector can't raise the capital on themselves by themselves to do. So Adam Smith's talking about this. You know, classic is the BBC 100 years ago. We really want to control how people think, but we're now in denial about this. Say, well, the markets have to do it, otherwise we'll probably get it wrong. That seems an incredibly cowardly way to organize society. Fifth and final point, what sort of questions do we need to address with by opening up economics? Well, Leonard Savage, who was a sort of founder of modern statistics, he compared two types of world. One was called small worlds, which of course, a very famous actuary, Thomas Bayes, a clergyman who, in fact, economics used to be taught in the actuarial science department on the continent to start with. And Bayes had a way of reducing uncertainty into risk for issues where they are repeated, they're repeated events, so very sort of small risks. And Leonard Savage referred to these as look before you leap. He used the parable of looking before you leap. But there's another world where actually we don't really know all the consequences, not repeated. And for this, he used the word, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. In other words, we don't know. But there's lots of other ways of decision-making, such as heuristics. Gerenz's talked a lot about fast and frugal decision trees. which do not rely on Bayesian theory, and they're much more suitable for these sort of big questions of climate change, financial stability, and I would say actually knowledge growth and innovation. So I think those 5 areas are really where we need to push the boundaries. My final point, William raised the issue of imagination. I think it was George Shackle who said, uncertainty is the price we pay for imagination. If we didn't have uncertainty, you'd have no need for imagination. Computers could work it out. So given that we like having imagination, it's what makes us human, it's probably a good idea to start looking at the other side of that, of how do we deal with real uncertainty then? Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. That's fantastic. So great introductions from all 3 of you, and certainly food for thought. And it's great to see we've already got quite a bank of questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to start with questions from myself. So Lucy, I'm an actuary. I've been an actuary for 30 years, qualified a long time ago under previous syllabuses. So someone like me, this can be a bit bewildering, I guess. So what areas of alternate economics do you think we should be prioritizing as actuaries to understand and engage with?
Yeah, so I think one of the sort of almost sad things is that we don't tend to look a lot at economic history very much at all. And I think just more generally, we'd really benefit from that. And it sounds sort of quite a simple response, but I think when you actually sort of get down into it, you start to understand how the economic ideas of the particular time are shaped by the problems that they were trying to solve and the politics that were happening at that time. And it's really interesting. And the first thing that does is really just sort of widens up a view of, well, here are all these different ideas that are really diverse, and help me understand the world. And then you can sort of compare, well, does that still fit the view of the world that I'm facing today? And what aspects of that can be important? And what new tools do we have today that perhaps weren't available then and can be more useful now? And then the second part is for me, is really financial system and money and banking. So I think for me, that is integral to what we do. It's really important from a systemic risk perspective, and it's important to understand how we transition to net zero. So really understanding it as a complex system where there are interactions between the different financial institutions and how that impacts other outcomes. But it also, when you look at it on a global level, it really helps you understand the challenges that low-income countries have in accessing finance, because we're operating in this global dollarized system. We've had Fed interventions this week that have been trying to support banking systems in other countries. Now, that's because the Federal Reserve is sort of at the top of this hierarchy in the global financial system. And I think in order to really understand things like that are of course relevant to our roles as actuaries, we need an understanding of that system and how it operates.
Excellent, thanks, Lucy. And I guess for someone to get started on this, the best just going onto the IFoA website and looking at the member interest group, and there's plenty of stuff there for them to browse through.
Yeah, there is. And I mean, join the economics MIG, because talking to us is the best way to do it. And I've certainly got a list of references that if people want to look at certain things, I can give to them, and it will speed up their learning journey, because actually my pathway was probably quite inefficient, because you're sort of exploring things for yourself. And if somebody else can sort of give you a load of references. The other thing to highlight is that it's actually a really diverse group of people. So if it's not one thing that you've heard me talk about today that you're interested in, but it is something else, there will be someone else in that group that can help.
Thanks, Lucy. Okay, and building on the question for you, William, I think you might have mentioned this complexity economics. Can you sort of outline what that's about and how it differs from neoclassical economics?
Sure. Well, complexity economics is a very interdisciplinary group of people. So it's drawn from a whole range of disciplines, from physics, from neuroscience, from anthropology, from social psychology, evolutionary biology. So it's a group of people, and to take the starting point of this, they think about individuals differently. So it's not the Homo economicus idea, which suggests that individuals are asocial, transactional, self-regarding, utility maximizers. But what we know about humans is they're intensely social, they're highly cooperative, and they make decisions inductively, heuristically, and they have group reasoning. So that's one way of thinking about them. But if you look to other disciplines, we know that individuals, and evolution indeed, has given us the tools to successfully navigate life in groups. And this includes hormonal responses that trigger caring instincts, its neural capacities that vicariously experience the welfare of others, and behavioral strategies for reciprocity, cooperation, and punishment to those who violate group norms. So it's a completely different way of thinking about individuals. Individuals themselves are complex. Then when they interact, we have all sorts of emergent phenomena that Angus mentioned. And the problem with neoclassical economics is that it's essentially a framework that we're all locked into. And it assumes essentially that the system is relatively stable, even though you have a highly complex global economy, which is made up of 50 million firms, hundreds of billions of consumers, webs of contracts in the trillions. You have all of these things interacting, and yet it's supposed to self-organize in a way that's stable. Complexity economists don't look at it top down like that, essentially all we need to do is get the structural policy settings right, that if you have flexibility in labor markets and competition in product markets and functioning financial markets, that this all self-organized. And the more efficient we can make it, the more competition we can have in the system, the more it will optimize it and lead to economic growth. Complexity is the idea that we actually start through the interaction, and what emerges from that is things like innovation, it's financial crises, it's a whole range of things. So it's more bottom up than top down. And I think it provides us also with some tools like agent-based approaches, which can be used to simulate the economy. So we should really be simulating the dynamics that are emerging from interaction. And that's probably a better way of doing things. And the behavior of an individual, they need not be complicated. Complicated behavior can emerge from the interaction of relatively simple individuals. And so it's the analogy that ants, they don't understand how the anthill works, but it emerges. So, and we should focus also on feedbacks which modify the behavior of the system. So that's just maybe a brief overview of some of the ideas there.
Great, thanks, William. It's really, really helpful. Angus, one for you. So people often say they don't like uncertainty, but there's these days it seems to be unavoidable and everywhere. How can economics help in these circumstances? Can it be a useful discipline in these circumstances?
So I think that one of the problems is the word uncertainty itself. We have one word to describe an enormous amount of possible events. And so one often thinks as uncertainty is this thing that sort of hits you like a train or something like that, something outside that is bad for you. Actually, uncertainty is what we create every day by our actions. So you've just asked me a question and I'm responding, and you don't quite know how I'm going to respond. So the one way to avoid this is don't ask the question, right? And then there's not a problem, you don't get the uncertainty. But actually don't make any progress that way either. And so most uncertainty is actually generated by ourselves, our own actions, by interacting with each other. So there's one big takeaway, I think, which goes across most of these sort of so-called alternative or heterodox or non-orthodox approaches. I would say the most important part of that is interaction. Once you start having agents interact, you get different outcomes, and uncertainty is the flip side of interaction. I would say it's because of uncertainty that we began interacting in the first place to look after our tribe, and now our tribe, we need to get bigger protection and so on and so forth. But they're one and the same. And businessmen, I always find it peculiar when they say they don't like uncertainty. You hear this line all the time on the TV. If you don't have any uncertainty, you haven't got any profits, because AI will pretty soon work out how to do the probabilities if there's no uncertainty, and there won't be any money for you to make, apart from, you know, just bribing senators. Everything will be decided for you. You won't have anything to explore. It's because of uncertainty that we make what Adam Smith called connections either between ideas and concepts or patterns in our minds, or connections between people. And that's how we start to create knowledge, by putting things together in our heads or by talking to other people. Knowledge is what's actually allowed us to progress over the last 300 years. And if that's not part of your discipline or your science, then there's obviously something lacking. So excluding uncertainties, you can't explain that huge increase of knowledge over the last 300 years. Well, what sort of discipline have you got? And so that's why I think uncertainty has to be absolutely integral to how we start thinking about economics properly.
Excellent, thanks. Lucy, coming back to you, and there's a couple of questions from the audience on this already, so maybe you can sort of pick them up in one answer. That, and one of the latest sessions in this series focuses on sustainability and climate, but can you talk a little bit about that now? Why is economics important from a sustainability perspective?
Well, the good news is you've got another session on this because it really does need it. I was going to ask you, how long have you got? Because so I think the thing for me is that the current economic system has led us into a situation where we're now dealing with planetary breakdown. So the Dasgupta report really lays out quite nicely how we have failed to take into account the natural assets that underpin the whole economy and the consequences of that. You know, we've had the World Economic Forum number that 44 trillion of global GDP, or over half of GDP, is underpinned by nature, and that's kind of not a surprise really, because it's food, it's medicine, it's natural resources, it's all the things that make the economy turn. And we've just had out this week, the other big news, other than multiple banking crises, has been the planetary crisis. We've had the 6th assessment report out, sort of outlining that we're at 1.1 degrees post-industrial warming. Sea level rise is going to continue for centuries to millennia. We're near to irreversible impacts on ecosystems. And we're going to have risk cascades because climate and non-climate risks interact. And all of these things are both a consequence of the economic system, but also the economic system in which we operate slows down action towards some of these issues. So if we think about modeling our economy as an equilibrium system with no recognition of tipping points and no representation of the financial system, what we tend to find is that we're underestimating the economic impacts that we suffer from physical risk. And this is quite clear when you look at the differences between what scientists tell us, and thankfully is reflected in globally agreed climate and nature goals, and what the economists will tell us is an economically optimal level of warming. And they do not agree. And the other part of that is that we tend to underestimate tech deployment. So Doan Pharma produced a paper, I think last year, looking at technology forecasts and the energy transition. And I think Simon Sharp in the next session will discuss this in more detail. But this was looking at projected costs of renewable energy, and he looked at that group looked at the integrated assessment models and the International Energy Agency projections of the cost of renewables. Those projections expected costs per year to fall by about 2.6%. The actual empirical fall that we got in those costs was 15% per year. So it massively underestimated the benefits of that transition, whilst also sort of in more general terms underestimating the impacts of really high physical risk scenarios. And then, you know, we discount things that happen really far away in the future, even though they might be catastrophic to future generations. So actually those things together may sort of delay action on climate change. The other thing is, if we're not representing the financial system properly, because neoclassical economics doesn't really do that, it ignores the role that the financial system itself has in contributing to climate risks, so through things like credit allocation. But it also misses the implications for things like asset price shocks and how that might get transmitted across the system. So actually, it's quite a important area. The other thing is that sort of government policy is driven by economics, and we need to decarbonize, and we need to do it as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, we need governments to be taking risks on new technologies. So in the sort of Mazzucato early lender of first resort in that sense, but also government spending decisions have massive environmental impacts. So we had an environmental audit committee report out just last year saying that the Treasury should incorporate nature and climate goals in their spending decisions. Well, of course they should, because they're a massive part of the economic system. So I think that sort of gives a sort of high level view of why it's important. Something like the Sustainable Development Goals highlights the level of interactions. So you've got economic topics in there alongside nature topics and environmental topics and social topics, and how they all interact, and the fact that we've got 17 of them shows us that it's really hard to achieve any of them in isolation, and we need to look at them together. So hopefully that's the short answer. We could do another session, and indeed we are, so I will hand back to you.
Thanks, Lucy, that's great. I mean, I suppose building on that, and there's almost 30 questions in the Q&A, which we're not really able to get through. I'm trying to sort of bring out some general themes. So maybe, Angus, William, this is for you. That there's a couple of questions around, you know, historically we've focused on economic growth as the kind of key measure, whether it's GDP or some proxy to that. Is that measure now redundant? And if so, what should it be replaced with? And are there alternate metrics out there?
Well, maybe I'll start and then turn over to Angus. But the yeah, so this has been a debate that's been going on for quite a while about measures of growth and progress. And I think we put a lot on GDP to assume that it was a measure that was supposed to tell us something about societal welfare or well-being. It was a measure of productivity when Kuznets and others worked on it. And it has been taken out of context to some degree. The problem that I see is that it's clear that optimization as a policy objective is problematic, because, and much of our economics has been about increasing efficiency and increasing optimization growth. But given that we're dealing with very fragile, complex systems, whether it's financial markets or nature interacting with the economy or the economy itself, the more you optimize a complex system, the more unstable it becomes. So it might be the wrong idea to try and optimize everything or to go for efficiency. We need to build resilience buffers into the system. And so we need to look beyond GDP. It's a useful measure in itself, but we do need to complement it with how it's affecting other systems, because these vulnerabilities can emerge even if the aggregate statistics show that things are going well or the economy is healthy. A financial crisis can emerge, and even though financial stability indicators can often show that there isn't a problem, these issues can still emerge. So statistics are kind of secondary importance to understanding how the system works and appreciating how it works and what sort of dynamics it has. A final point is that there are lots of alternative measures now. There's well-being, there's OECD has its Better Life Index, and it looks at all sorts of things in addition to income. It looks at environment, social connection, housing, all of these broader measures of societal well-being. The problem is that you can't really condense it into one measure. And so it's useful and it's interesting information, but it's not possible to create an index. And by the way, in the OECD, we did create an index once called a multidimensional living standard, which was tried to provide a measure which was different from GDP, and it added in things like inequalities, health, life expectation, education levels, etc. And the measure, it showed that if you take a comparison between Italy and the United States, Italy is always used as an example of a country which has inadequate structural reforms, and it has growth levels which are much lower than the United States. But when we use this multidimensional standard, Italy actually was higher than the United States. Not surprisingly, this measure has never seen the light of day because countries generally don't like measures where they do less well. So we should be very aware that there's a highly politicized environment around statistics. And so you can generate as much information as you want, but policymakers still have to make decisions. And I think it's the proliferation of so many different alternatives to GDP, which essentially undermines it. And so people say, well, we stick with GDP because at least we know that.
Thanks, William.
So perhaps I can just, I've had to scroll through some Q&A. And so perhaps I can just sort of try and bring a few of those together, which I thought were particularly worthy of raising. James Kenny asked this question about rationality. And I think it's very important to realize the context of which you decide what is rationality. So in a well-defined context, rationality means maximization or optimization. But what do you do when you can't list the possible outcomes? So it's mathematically impossible to optimize. What is then the right rational response? How are you defining rational? So then we get into things like ecological rationality, where you can say, well, actually, the first 5 things are the most important ones to take care of. And the fact is, I don't have to look down the rest of the distribution because the consequences are too small. So, for example, if you say, which banks are going to be the next to fail? Actually, there's about 4 cutoffs you can use that as long as a bank satisfies these 4, then the chances of it failing are so small, it's not really worth looking at. By the way, when this was showed to me by Gert Gigerenzer, who's written lots of books on how to do this sort of rationality under ill-defined circumstances, Credit Suisse was the one that failed these measures last September. So there's rationality depends on the context of what you're making the decision in. It doesn't mean to say that people are rational when you can't define all the possible outcomes. You have to find another way because optimization is simply mathematically impossible. There's another question about the mathematization of economics. And I think the point here is it's a question of what type of mathematization. So economics is for the large part, not solely, that would be unfair, but for the large part being driven by calculus. Calculus requires smooth continuous functions. That's how you take derivatives. Unfortunately, reality often doesn't have smooth continuous functions. It has sudden abrupt stops. And we know that the whole point about interaction is we know from Alan Turing, the Turing problem, which is when you have a sequence of actions where they take place, well, actions take place sequentially from more than one agent or more than one source, then you cannot tell, even with a very simple sequence, you cannot tell ex ante whether the system will stabilize itself in some sort of equilibrium or become recursive, just keep going round and round and round. That's the Turing problem. You don't know until you run it. Well, guess what? We now have these things called computers, and computers can do algorithmic mathematics. That is, what if? You know, it does what if, then we go this path, we go this path. That's a very different type of mathematics. It's no longer continuous. It's no longer only about optimization. And you can handle all sorts of different outcomes. And I suppose what the three of us are trying to say is not to say, don't pay any attention to the other sort of economics. That's not the message. The message is, why are you constraining yourself to that? There are other questions in this big world that require some quite careful thinking, running different scenarios, and it won't always end up in a glorious equilibrium. Sometimes life doesn't turn out that way. And the point is that these other methods that William mentioned can be very good at running scenario analysis in order for us to see what these other assumptions might lead us to. So I hope that's addressed a couple of those. If I can just raise one final point. So somebody said that it was nice to hear me agree with Lucy's introduction, and I did. But Lucy very courageously sort of added one point about convergence. And there's this really interesting aspect of economics, because we say either the market clears, okay, that's one thing, but convergence means you go from a point to the equilibrium. You somehow move, you get to it. Okay, so if that's the equilibrium, then presumably you mustn't have been in the equilibrium before in order to converge. That requires you have disequilibria theory. Well, in the orthodoxy, that is a non sequitur. There's no such thing as disequilibrium theory. So that's one of the weird things, you know. Adam Smith's invisible hand has got the sense of moving you towards something. That's convergence. But guess what? We don't actually have a theory for this. And what's so amazing is, you know, people do experimental economics like Vernon Smith in Colorado. If you get a group of people in a room, you say, right, you're the buyers, you're the sellers, here's your demand function, here's your supply function. Now just go ahead and interact. Almost instantly, they will solve the rational economic outcome. But how did they do it? How do they converge? And Smith comes to the view that actually it's an emergent process, that you start to mind read the other person and you know how they're going to respond. And this is human. And we have to bring this side of economics back into it, rather than just thinking you're always at the equilibrium, because sometimes humans misread as well, and it goes the other way. And only until you start allowing for those different interactions can you start looking at some very different outcomes, which could be good, could be bad. There's no prejudging it. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Angus, and thanks for picking up some of the questions in the chat. Lucy, I'm going to bring it back to you. There's an interesting question. I'll try and paraphrase it. It's sort of saying, fine, but, you know, a lot of what actuaries do these days, or traditionally have done, focuses on, you know, real net returns on investment savings. And is there, this is all well and good, this conversation, but is there a chance that we don't think about that enough, which is the sort of core assumption that actuaries use in their day-to-day work?
I think for this, it's actually really understanding where that is coming from. So actually that is valuable to understand it, because if that is coming, for example, because of population growth, or because of banks creating lots of credit, then that's useful information to know, and actually an alternative view of economics will bring that through. So I think that's very much part of this conversation. I'm not quite sure sort of the rest of the context of that, other than thank you from Martin.
Thanks, Lucy, that's great. There's a good, interesting question here. William, I think you sort of touched on the politicized nature of all of this. So I just wanted to ask you, and maybe Angus again, about this. You know, what is the role of government in moving from a if there is a role in moving from neoclassical to incorporating some of these ideas, and if so, what's the incentive, if you like, for politicians to do that?
Well, it's a great question. I think there are all sorts of gaps and discontinuities between academia, between policymaking and politics, and what's going on the streets, which is easy to say in Paris. But it was Greg Mankiw back in 2005 who said that the economic science, that was the economics that was used in academia, had almost no value to the economic engineers. They were the policymakers at the time he was working at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And so I think there is a real disconnect. And what we see in the US at the moment, for example, with the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, is, I think, politicians stepping beyond what would be considered normal economic advice and actually trying different things. It's the same actually with the green transition. I think the Biden administration doesn't want to hear about carbon taxes. It actually is interested in changing the structures of the economy. So I think that if you look at what's going on with people over the last few years, it's very clear that very standard economic policy advice has really failed to grapple with the complexity of society. And So the politicians are perhaps catching up on what's been happening, but in many cases they're turning their backs on traditional economics and therefore giving a great boost to some of this new thinking. But ultimately they're looking for better answers. And in the last few years, they haven't been finding them from academia and from economics community.
Thanks, William. Angus, any thoughts on that?
Well, when you asked the question, I was reminded by the famous quote from Keynes. I'll probably get it wrong a bit, I'll probably butcher it, at the end of the general theory, when he says the ideas of economists and political philosophers is more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Now, that's not to say we're very powerful, but it's to say that actually these ideas matter. And sometimes they go well, and sometimes they go horribly wrong, but they're kind of really important. I think sometimes, politicians want to get answers to questions without considering even basic economics. So, I'll be brave here and talk about the Edinburgh reforms, 30 measures to basically deregulate the financial sector. Luckily, we've just had a couple of banking problems, so that might make them think twice. I mean, it's not to say they're all wrong. It's just they're very difficult questions. These are really important, hard questions that you want to think about before you just go cavalier. I've got 30, that's a long list, isn't this good? No, it's not. Each one of them is extremely difficult and complicated. On the flip side, we had 2008. We all agreed that bail-in is absolutely essential next time, so meaning that taxpayers don't pay. Okay, we had the first one, SVB, guess what? The depositors got bailed out. So the first hurdle, it's failed. That is surely a massive wake-up call, just say, no, we just go ahead with lots more deregulation everywhere. These are difficult questions. Some can be reasonably analyzed very well indeed by existing economic models. Others are bigger questions where they involve things like uncertainty and interaction, where they're not appropriate for those sort of models. And I suppose what the three of us are trying to say is, let's not just limit ourselves to one approach. We have to think in rounder approaches in order to get the answers, because these answers really do matter. And as Lucy's been pointing out, some of these crucial questions, what sort of economic system is it that destroys itself? That's obviously not a healthy one. And so having a proper discussion about this, using different approaches, would surely be in everybody's interests. And I think that's what we're trying to raise. And that's why I think it's a very good series for you guys to be having and to be having this discussion.
That's great, thanks, Angus. I was hoping to sneak another question, but I don't think we've got time. That's a good place to close. I mean, that's exactly, Angus, what we're trying to do here is open the debate and have the discussion within the actuarial community. And I think this has been a great start to that. So, Philip, it's time to draw this particular event to a close. I wanted to thank everybody for attending. We've had almost 300 attendees, which is fantastic. So thank you all for finding the time. I'd like to thank the IFoA events team actually for making all the logistics work. So thank you for that. And of course, in particular, I'd like to thank Lucy, William and Angus for their brilliant contributions and for facilitating what I think has been a fascinating discussion and a great start to our series. So the next event in this series is on the 4th of April, Tuesday, 4th of April. It's 5 times faster. It's called The Invisible Infrastructure of Climate Change. So again, as I said at the start, you can register on the IFoA website, and I'd encourage you to do that, as well as the other seminars, which I think are all pretty much all scheduled, the dates now as well. So with that, I will conclude today's events. Thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of the day wherever you may be. Thanks very much.